If lawyers were as good at their jobs as doctors, we wouldn't need them. Okay, I joke. They kind of are necessary.
I'll squeeze them for every dime I can. Every single dime. I'm Jim the Hammer Shapiro.
Law and medicine are intertwined, and today we're going to explore that origin, specifically medical malpractice, how it began, how did it evolve, and how do we get modern malpractice? Also, how do we get ambulance chasers? Again, I'm joking, kind of. But before we can explore the origins of medical malpractice, we have to define it.
We're going to do everything in our power to make this up to you, Eric. For starters, I think I owe you some ice cream.
Formally, malpractice is defined as a type of medical professional negligence where there is failure to meet a certain degree of skill or care. This failure causes or results in harm or injury. In other words, there's a duty to perform that has failed and it causes injury to someone. This is not forgetting somebody's name or leaving a patient in the room for a long time. This deals with leaving a scalpel in somebody, removing the wrong limb, or giving too little or too much medicine which causes harm. In order for malpractice to happen, several elements must be met. These are the elements. There's a duty of care. Physician has a responsibility to provide a level of care, essentially the responsibility. A breach of duty. The physician or medical professional fails to meet a medical standard. Causation. A physician's negligence causes direct harm to a patient. You caused an injury to a patient. And there's damages. The patient suffers harm or loss. Again, in malpractice, all these elements must be present. So let's go through some examples. Here's the first one. A pharmacist dispenses the wrong strength of medication, but the error is stopped before the patient takes it. This is not malpractice. It's a mistake, yes, and it doesn't meet the elements before. There was no harm. Next example. A nurse administers the wrong strength of medication, which leads to life-threatening complications. This second example is an example of malpractice. It does meet all the elements before harm was caused. So that's it. It's all neat definition.
Oh, I see. Then everything is wrapped up in a neat little package.
Well, medicine isn't always that neat. Well, let's rewind the clock to when doctors were more likely to bleed you than to heal you. We start with the Hammurabi Code. You can think of this as an ancient Yelp, where if you got a 1-star review, you get your hand chopped off. I wish I was joking. Yes, it was an ancient Babylonian code created in about 1754 BC, and it represents one of the earliest written medical laws. And it was built on several points. One, there was a fee structure, a scaled fee structure, where depending on your social class, you would pay more. So for example, nobles paid more for medical care. It also highlighted physician training. It outlined requirements for training before a physician could practice on their own. Patients' rights. Rights were established upon payment. So essentially, once the physician was paid, they could have consequences that were established from the patient's rights. And then punishment. Medical error was harsh in this time, and this could result in amputation. So for example, if a surgeon failed in his duties, yes, your hand could be chopped off, but this was a real thing. While the code does address medical error and its consequences, it does not fit the criteria of medical malpractice. If you remember, the elements of malpractice are extremely specific. And what the Hammurabi Code doesn't do, it doesn't establish a duty of care, it doesn't establish negligence. It just really focuses on retribution rather than compensation of the injured party. The Hippocratic Oath. Once upon a time, doctors decided to make a promise to do no harm. Okay, cue the malpractice lawyers. Okay, but in all seriousness, you can't talk about the evolution of medical malpractice without mentioning the Hippocratic Oath. It serves as the foundational document for medical ethics and thus highlights the duties of a physician to their patient. Although there is many variations of the Hippocratic Oath, here are some of the foundational principles and points that must be met. 1, to do no harm. One has a duty to not intentionally harm a patient. patients first. What this means is that you prioritize the patient's health and well-being, confidentiality, protect the patient's privacy, protect the patient's information, and professional conduct. Maintain a high ethical standard. What the oath does highlight is, again, an ethical standard. It emphasizes that care should be patient-centered, and you should, again, avoid harm. While it's not a legal document, it does serve to influence and develop a ethical standard, and later throughout the years, it helped to build a legal standard.
Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt.
I hope you don't mind that we continued on without you.
Said I was sorry. No need to be sarcastic.
While the previous mentioned Hammurabi Code focused more on punitive measures or punishments for mistakes, the Hippocratic Oath focuses more on, again, patient protections and professional conduct. It brings medicine in general closer to a general standard of practice. The shortcomings of the oath in the cases of medical malpractice is it lacks legal enforcement. Again, it is not a legal document. It focuses more on ethics, and today's medical malpractice deals with liability and compensation. Furthermore, it doesn't define an overall standard of medicine, and later from those standards, we can determine negligence. Now we come upon the first documented case of medical malpractice. Well, kind of. Stratton versus Swalland. This case took place in England in 1374. The case involved surgeon John Swalland, who treated patient Agnes of Stratton for a severe hand injury. Agnes and her husband sued the surgeon, claiming that her hand remained deformed after treatment. While the case ultimately was dismissed, it did lay down the foundation for future malpractice law. And how did it lay down this foundation? Well, it highlighted several things. The need for a standard to compare practitioners to. It's not enough to say the doctor didn't fix my hand. Could another doctor in the same situation do it? Could most doctors do it? Other questions that the case highlighted was, are you guaranteed a result? Did the physician harm you? And is an attempt to treat the same thing as harm? Nowadays, a doctor isn't automatically liable if treatment is not successful. There's a lot more nuance in medicine today, and today's laws now reflect that. Intermission. So I'd like to take a moment, if you're enjoying this content, and you could help me out by, again, hitting that thumbs up and subscribing. Thanks again, and let's continue. In following early medicine and the laws that govern it, we see how we transition through many things. One, the Hammurabi laws, which were more of an eye for an eye, to the creation of the Hippocratic Oath, which again set down ethical standards, to one of the OG medical malpractice cases. These transitions in law and medicine also display why medical malpractice must be adaptive. These adaptations are built off of several things: the development of medicine, the development of how physicians practice, and essentially advances and changes in the law. And it also reflects the expectation of the general society.
Dr. Nick, this malpractice committee has received a few complaints against you. Of the 160 gravest charges, the most troubling are performing major operations with a knife and fork from a seafood restaurant.
Overall, this constant adaptation is a good thing. It helps guide physicians, it helps guide patients, and again, it helps guide the public.
I'm a doctor, not an historian.
It keeps doctors on their toes, and again, it helps lay down that foundation which we judge success or failure. Anyways, the law is a living, breathing thing, and so is medicine. So you have to change with it.